It's lovely to be here, and I've been. It was also lovely to see some familiar faces as you popped up in your little in the little boxes that we're all inhabiting at the moment. I've been involved, as Elizabeth has hinted, with the National Deaneries Network because of my connection to Elizabeth. And she and I were both serving in Tower Hamlets. Elizabeth continues to live in Tower Hamlets. And I wanted to, let me just tell you what I'm going to do, but I'm going to start in a moment with a little account of an exercise that she and I did together. We've just worked it out. It was in 2004 in the Deanery of Tower Hamlets. So what I'm planning to do through the course of the evening, and you can push me in different ways if you want to push me in different ways. But I thought I'd just outline where I think we are at the moment by casting us back to where Elizabeth and I were in 2004, and then to reflect on some particular issues that seem to have emerged in various ways over the last several months. So talking about the vision and strategy process, about the various things that have flowed from that, just touch on the Save the Parish movement, the GS 2222, and the context we're in. And the question I want to ask and to invite you to reflect on as I talk about that is, what's going on? What's underneath the sort of reaction and engagement and concerns that we have in relation to the issues there? And then I'm going to say a bit about, and the plan is that I stop at 8 o'clock and then we have breakout groups. So this will either be before the breakout groups or after. Say a bit about where we are present in my view, and my view is both local in terms of Suffolk, but it's also national in terms of my role as chair of Ministry Council, and I'm on every other committee you could possibly imagine for my sins. So I do get to see some of the conversations and experience some of the conversations that are going on in different parts of the church, the national bodies. And I wanted then to give, just to end, an illustration, again from Suffolk, of how we're engaging with the challenges that we're facing, which are sort of attempting to delineate what we think the future might look like, and to do that with reference, amongst other things, but with reference to deaneries. Because I think one of the things we're seeing through the processes that various dioceses are going through is that the deaneries are, as it were, the right size for some of the sorts of discussions and decisions that need to be taken. So that's where I wanted to end up. So that gives you a little outline. So let me start with the story. Elizabeth and I were stirred into action, and various other people in the Deanery of Tower Hamlets, because the Archdeacon had produced a list of the parishes and marked them on that list about whether they were viable or non-viable, which you can imagine produced a rather furious response from clergy and laity. And we decided that what we would rather do is to take this into our own hands, rather than simply let the Archdeacon decide which ones we're going to close on the basis of non-viability, and look at the question of vitality. Were we vital or not vital? And to focus in that direction. I apologise to Alistair here to referring to an archdeacon in perhaps not the most enthusiastic terms here, but I've learned better since. And so we set up a little strategy group in the deanery, which Elizabeth and I were on, and we worked, I think, phenomenally hard to try and work out what's a sustainable pattern of the deployment of ordained clergy in that deanery. As an exercise we did, We made various recommendations, which included closing one parish, merging into another. We attempted to close another one, but we discovered the Archdeacon had designs on it for something else. The bishop wanted to close another one, but we stopped him doing that. And through that, there was one of the things that happened in the process was that financially, the whole exercise turned around. And rather than, we started as the most dependent deanery in the whole of the Diocese of London, and we ended up getting close to supporting ourselves. So that was a good experience for us. But the interesting thing, when just reflecting with Elizabeth, was that at no point did it occur to us to look at the deployment of lay ministers. We were only focused on clergy. And in fact, I don't think we looked at the deployment of self-supporting clergy. I think we looked at stipendiary clergy. So fast forwarding to last year here in Suffolk, I, with a group of people, went through an exercise to see what the deployment of ministry looks like and could look like in the diocese. And as we did that exercise, yes, we were looking at the deployment of ordained ministers, self-supporting and stipendiary, but we were also looking at readers, licensed lay ministers, licensed evangelists, licensed pioneer ministers, family and children's workers, youth workers, and so forth. And recognizing that the range of ministries which serve, enable, build up the body and all of us in our Christian life and witness, that range of ministries has expanded extraordinarily in just the last 20 years. Now, I'm sure you've got very similar experiences, but I think just for me as a starting point, I wanted to highlight the fact that we are now, when we use the word ministry, and there are all sorts of other complications that we have about using the word ministry, because we all are called to ministry by virtue of baptism. So we're using here in a specific way in relation to particular roles and activities that are on behalf of and for the sake of the mission of the church. And when we use that word now, we use it in a much broader sense than we used it even 20 years ago. And just to kind of three relatively recent elements in that, which I think it would just be worth us remembering. One is the whole setting God's people free process, which I think has been one of the most extraordinary exercises in certainly my recent memory of the life of the church, embraced to different extents by different dioceses, but I think where it has been embraced, you can see it's begun to make a difference. The little document, tiny document that we produced in Ministry Council, called Ministry for a Christian Presence, which was published as a GS-MISC document, where we start out, first of all, by looking at the nature of God and God in Trinity, and reflecting that God in Trinity is a relating and ascending God, and calls us into lives that are both relational and being sent, and that the whole body of Christ, the whole people of God, are called into that relationship with God to be witnesses, to be faithful servants, to be in relationship with God. So we start our consideration about, as it were, the more formal ministries from the ministry of the whole people of God. And out of that, then, people have vocations to particular forms of ministry. And so we delineate those, but delineate them very much as issuing from the body for the sake of the body. And of course, that's if you read the preface to the ordination service, the first part of the ordination service, that makes that blatantly clear. So we've started doing ordination services starting at the font and renewing baptismal vows as the beginning of that service. So just to remind us that that's the foundation and that we are all called. So that little document, Ministry for a Christian Presence, spells some of that out. And then some of you may have seen more recently in the last year or so, Kingdom Calling, which is a Faith and Order Commission document, which is a really, I think it's a really challenging and exciting exploration of the theology of lay ministry. And it does that in a way that looks at the context, particularly the secularized context in which we are, and looks at the sorts of things that inhibit our embrace of the calling that God places on each one of us. And the secular context is part of that, but so is our failure of theological imagination. And so just challenging is in various ways to expand our understanding of God and what God is calling us to. So that's a kind of for me, it's a helpful reminder to say that we've actually come quite a distance, and that does rather indicate a direction of travel that I think we need to be taking really seriously. And of course, all the language about discipleship is language about what is the calling of the whole people of God. And how do we deepen that calling? And I see a request to put the documents up. If I can, when I take a breath in a moment, I will put them up on the chat. So into this then comes a vision and strategy exercise led by Stephen Cottrell, where he made a very deliberate intention to listen to a wide range of voices, and particularly to young voices, and particularly to a diversity of backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, economic, social backgrounds, and so forth. So went through a listening process, not this summer, just gone, the previous summer. And it was out of that we got the little mantra, simpler, humbler, bolder, which I think is something that people have picked up on, and it resonates. We get a set. We're not quite sure what it means, but we get a sense that it means something really important. So let's pay attention to it. So that struck, I think, a really positive chord with people. And then the three the areas in which the listening process produced some kind of focal points for a strategic direction, which had to do with the growing younger and more diverse, had to do with mixed ecology, and had to do with being missionary disciples. And it was out of that some of these bold figures emerged about having 10,000 new Christian communities, about 30,000 leaders for working with children and young people, and about 3,000 churches focused on active young disciples. Now, part of this is about, it's certainly ambitious. Part of it is about presentation. And at one point in this exercise, I was trying to encourage us to be able to look at these sorts of numbers as in relation to what is existing at present. Because one of the things, a previous goal that the church gave itself was, which I think we believe was as it were, we were inspired to give ourselves, was the goal to increase the number of ordinands by 50%. Now, in a diocese like this, increasing the number of ordinands by 50% was something we could say, oh yeah, okay, that sounds a really good idea. We can do that. I mean, I think it meant increasing from 4 to 6. Now, no other dioceses have much higher figures, and we now have much higher figures. But it was an achievable aspiration. And one of the challenges about, having, for instance, 10,000 new Christian communities is I do try and do the sum in my head and think, well, that's, however many hundred, that's got to be in Suffolk. I mean, I have enough trouble with the ones I've got. So you trying to get a kind of realistic perspective, what actually is meant by this is part of the challenge. And I think one of the reasons that some of these ambitious and rightly ambitious targets have been so criticized is because they don't seem to emerge from the context of what we understand and what we're familiar with. And so I think it's part of what's been going on. Now, of course, that whole thing was then compounded by the emergence of the so-called Myriad project, John McGinley's comments about people like me being a limiting factor. Then we've had the emergence of the Save the Parish movement, which has then latched on to, as I said, to the Green Paper, a discussion and consultation paper, which was endorsed for discussion by General Synod in July on the revision of the mission and pastoral measure. So all of that's been going on. We sometimes forget that we have been in the most appalling pandemic as well. And that, so part of my question when I ask us, what is it that, what's been really going on is there's a sort of febrile atmosphere, and this is not just in the church, it's in all sorts of quarters, that is, seems to have emerged from our kind of feeling we're coming out a little bit of this current situation, but not being so sure about how well we're coming out of it. So a real sense of anxiety, a huge sense of exhaustion, a profound sense of loss and grief. And so all of that is going on as well. And, in terms of the life of the church, I listen to John Spence remind me at virtually every meeting I'm at, where he's also there, that the dioceses collectively have an accumulated deficit of £140 million over the last 3 years, which is his basis of his argument that we've got to do things radically different because we haven't got a sustainable model at the moment. So that's the kind of context, and that it's out of that I want to ask that question: what is going on? But let me carry on a little bit and say a few things about what is actually happening at the moment at the national level that I'm familiar with in terms of the life of the church in relation to ministry. I think one of the things where I would say there is the Save the Parish movement and the vision and strategy are both talking about the same thing, is where they're talking about the vital importance of local ministry. In one form or another, local ministry is crucial to the thriving, the development, the sustaining of the life of the church in whatever form it is. And I don't want to lose sight of that, because in all of those numbers that get used, underneath that is the real sense that we are asking God to call people to work in communities with groups of people, perhaps groups of people that the church hasn't been engaged with wholeheartedly before, and to work in those contexts for the sake of proclaiming the gospel. And so there is that sort of common ground there that I think I find helpful to use as the basis for exploration. One of the other things that's going on at the moment is a review of our theological education sector, which is partly the response to, well, no, it's entirely the response to the fact that a new funding model was introduced a few years ago, and there was a commitment to review that model. But we've expanded the remit. And in the work we're doing on this, one of the things we're wanting to do is to come up with a model, a funding model, that enables the training for people for lay ministry in that same context. One of the difficulties we've had at the moment is that what the ordained and the lay, those called to those ministries, particularly licensed lay ministries, are not, the resources available to the ordained are not available to those training for lay ministry necessarily. Now that varies from place to place, but we want to try and build a more consistent picture and a greater level of accessibility to that. The issue of discernment is important here as well. If I can just put this in, this may seem like a series of little disjointed comments, but I'm filling my time up till 8 o'clock. The issue of discernment is an ongoing question. We've just changed the model of discernment for ordained ministry, but what should we be doing about discernment for lay ministries? Is it simply a question of the vicar tapping somebody on the shoulder and saying, "Do you think you would like to do this?" And I know it's more than that, but are there ways in which we need to be looking at that process of discernment in similar ways, not as elaborate, but in similar sorts of ways as we do for ordained ministry? And then the other part of that is, why do we do discernment at one point and then stop? Actually, all of us, in whatever vocation we're called to, that vocation will take different shifts and turns and directions. And we need to be paying attention to what God is calling us to at different stages in our lives. And can we find a way to support people in that process of discernment? So that's another range of questions that we're looking at in the context of ministry division. Let me just finish, and then it will be time for breakout groups. Some characteristics, and Elizabeth reminded me of this, that when we were doing the exercise in Tower Hamlets, one of the things we were trying to do was to enable parishes to be much more collaborative together, working together. And she has just said to me that she's still trying to achieve that. One of the words that has emerged in the discourse about ministry, lay and ordained, in the Church of England has been this word collaboration. And the sense that this is not about the vicar telling everybody what to do. This is a mutual relationship between people called to a range of ministries, lay and ordained, working together for a common purpose. And one of the things we see, for instance, and I'll say a bit more about this after the break, but one of the things that we see here in Suffolk, and many of you will be very familiar with this, is that in large rural multi-parish benefices, you need a team of people who are actually going to draw on one another for support, for wisdom, for guidance, Some have one set of skills, others have another set of skills. So how do we actually see ourselves as a body where each body has a valued part to play in that? So collaboration is an important dimension of this. I mentioned at the very beginning the word relational and deriving that from the nature of the Trinity. And we also see that ministry is in so many ways about relationships. One of the things that this is another whole exercise that I've been involved in, listening to dioceses, clergy, laity, people from a whole range of different contexts, talking about what they value or don't value from the national church provision. And in the course of that, one of the things that really surprised me was clergy in particular were over and again saying what they really value is having a relationship with their archdeacon and their bishop, that they wanted to feel that they were known, supported, cared for, and encouraged, and that relationship through which they experienced that was vital. So that relationality operates in a number of different directions in the course of the life and the flourishing of the church. The other word, and I don't like the word, I wish it's missional. It's in my vocabulary, that's not a real word. I'd say missionary, perhaps, but you know what I mean, because we use it all the time. We are in such a different context than we were. Even now, I was ordained 43 years ago. When I started, the sorts of challenges that we face today simply weren't there. Challenges of people not having a clue or any interest whatsoever in the nature of the gospel. And so we have to recognize that we are needing to operate differently. And of course, most of us do recognize that. But it is a bigger shift than we probably acknowledge most of the time. And the last word, the last word I'll refer to here is the word which I think is key to so much here. And again, it's a word that we can speak about profoundly in terms of our relationship with God, but then we struggle to speak about in terms of our relationship with one another. And that's the word trust. And as I look about me in all sorts of dimensions of the life of the church, the thing that I think probably we all stumble over in many different ways, whether this is relationship within a parish, between parishes, between the bishop and the clergy, between this group and that group, between bishops and each other. The issue of trust is absolutely fundamental. And one of the questions I have is why when trust is at the heart of what it means to be Christian, because our trust in God and our trust in the saving work of Jesus, why is our trust of one another so hard? So I'm going to stop there and just invite you to, in your groups, which will be for 10 minutes, to reflect on that kind of bigger question about what is going on with all of these forces, febrile responses, almost polarization. What's going on there? And can we kind of look beyond that? And perhaps you might want to reflect for a moment on the question of trust as well. I just wanted to say a little bit about how we're trying to tackle some of these issues here in Suffolk. So if I could say that for a couple of minutes, and then I'm happy to work through whatever questions you think it would be helpful for me to try and explore. I'm very conscious that I've seen at least one priest from the Diocese of St Ed's and Ips, and I've seen one lay member of Bishop's Council. So I'm going to be very careful what I say. Um, so we went through an exercise, and I've just referred to this. Went through an exercise a couple of years ago, and then other elements of it during the pandemic, to explore a bit more deeply about what the ministry was that the communities of Suffolk required, and to ask that question as hard and as challenging as we could, and to ask it in a variety of contexts. And it was out of that there emerged a very clear and strong view that we simply couldn't afford to cut the number of stipendiary posts if we believed God was calling us to do all the things and engage in the communities in all the ways that we believe we're called to. And in a peculiar way, we're just talking about this in the break, in a peculiar way, that's been borne out in the pandemic, because what we've seen is clergy and laity working together, responding to a whole host of needs in their communities. And the clergy and laity are collaborating together on that, and often it's laity who are taking the initiative and going off embarking on new forms of provision of food or pastoral care or whatever it is. But the clergy have been the kind of, the ring holders in that process. So we're committed to retaining our stipendiary numbers. We recognize that they may not be necessarily located in the right places at the moment, and then there could be some sort of shuffling around a bit. There's some unevenness in distribution, although what evenness looks like, I'm not quite sure, in a largely rural diocese. I'm also very conscious that we ask particularly our rural clergy, although in some cases our town clergy, to do unbelievably huge jobs. So how do we make that manageable? Now, Gavin Oldham, I knew Gavin was going to ask this question, because it's a question he always asks me. But Gavin's question, it gets to part of that, which is, what are the ways in which we can try and find mechanisms to relieve the burdens of administration and so forth, and do things in different ways, or in perhaps the same way rather than a variety of different ways, to try and remove that burden. And just I'm just saying this to answer Gavin's question and to explain why I'm not talking about this at great length. We've got a project going at the moment which Adrian Harris, who used to run the digital office at Church House, is running, listening to and determining what sort of areas we could usefully support parishes and dioceses in by providing shared services of one sort or another. So a typical example would be what would happen if we actually had a common bookkeeping package that everybody used the same package, for example. So there are that exercise is going on, and that will be reporting in the next few months. So Gavin, if you can bear waiting a bit longer, I'll give you a fuller answer later. But we've been looking at how do we make these roles sustainable, and this goes back to the comment I made very early on about the importance of the local. And certainly in rural communities, having somebody in your village who is identified as the minister, or the person who is the church person, who is a point of reference, who it keeps an eye on the neighborhood and so forth. That, using the language which we've heard before in this evening of focal minister, although I don't like the term focal because it makes feel that the minister is the focus, which isn't, of course, the case. So we say local minister here. but building up patterns of local ministry, ordained and lay, to ensure that each community, as best as possible, each community has someone there who is the representative, the holder of the presence of the church, with the rest of the congregation, with others, but being that person, and them being a part of a team which is led by the stipendiary priest, who may have 10 villages to look after, but can't be in 10 places. So that's the sort of approach we've taken here. That it partly goes back to also to Elizabeth's comment about collaboration. So that's collaboration within teams, but then looking at how we collaborate within deaneries so that we break down some of these barriers and build up some trust between parishes and benefices across deaneries, and then to take that a step further in terms of relationship with clergy and laity across the diocese. So it's a long project, but that's the sort of direction of travel, with a really clear sense of being that active Christian presence in every community, seeking different ways in which that gets expressed, but committed to somehow being a vehicle for the proclamation of the gospel in each place. The one of the key pieces, or two things I'll say further about this. First of all, we haven't got a blanket plan for the whole diocese, and I think that's quite key, because places vary. I mean, rural in one part of Suffolk is very different from rural in another part of Suffolk, and one market town isn't like another market town. So we really do have to work out, what do these patterns look like locally? And we, with some sort of basic principles, working principles, but then to have those conversations to see what works best. And then so I see the question about how laity enabled. We've had not in a kind of public way, but for the last few years in the diocese, there's been quite a sort of intention on the part of the bishops and the archdeacons to be permission giving to clergy as well as to laity. One of the things that I discovered, I probably shouldn't say this in front of people who are in the diocese, that I discovered when I arrived here, was that people were asking me questions or asking permission for doing things that had never crossed my mind needed anybody's permission. So we've just tried to say, if it seems right in the context, I mean, within reason, of course, if it seems right in the context in which you are, then please, you're the best judge of that. You are the best judge in the clergy and laity in that place. And that sort of disposition seems to have, in at least some places, not everywhere, seems to have engendered the same kind of quality of permission giving and receiving amongst laity too. The last thing I'd say is the financial model on which the Church of England currently operates is not a sustainable model, but that is not an argument, in my mind, for cutting clergy posts to get them to fit the amount of money you've got. The challenge, I think, is the other way around. How do we find other sources of income? That's what we need to be doing, not saying, how do we cut the number of posts? So that's the approach we've taken here. And we've got a group of people, including myself, looking at various ways in which, and it's a long haul, but we need to be aiming to turn that around with a clear conviction that God calls people to serve in these places, in these ways, and God will, through creativity and ingenuity and inspiration, help us find the ways to support that. And it's not pie in the sky. I think it's part of our exercise of trust. So let me stop, and perhaps Martin will point me to the questions I need to answer.
That's kind, Bishop. Thank you. Before I ask you the question, can I just point to the fact that the Bishop Martin's links are kindly in the chat room, so that's very helpful for us to pick up on those. So if you want to look to chat room, those links are there. I wonder if I could come to Anne Foreman And you put a very interesting question there about 825 about what's going on. Anne, if you want to, you're unmuted. Do you want to ask that question yourself for Bishop Martin? Thank you.
Well, there wasn't a question at the end of it, but the question really is about how to counter that fear. It was brought home to me by the recent elections we've got going on, and it was clear that people from one part of the church are worried, are fearful of losing their sacramental worship. People from another part of the church are fearful that their attention to biblical teaching and learning is being jeopardized. And it seems to me, I'm not standing for Synod again, but having stood a long time ago, that we've become much more tribal. And I think that it's fear and tribalism that is not helping trust. So how would you counter it?
Thank you, Anne. I think this is a really basic question, isn't it? It's an absolutely fundamental question. And I'll give a brief answer, but it deserves a much longer answer. So my brief response is that there are short-term issues, and there are very long-term issues about where has trust gone. My short-term response is, I think so long as we've got decision-making processes that present issues as either or, we are going to increase this sense of polarization, tribalism, whatever you want to call it. What I hope we can somehow do is to find ways to have the conversations where, first of all, we listen to each other and listen to the real concerns we have, discover what the foundation of one person's particular perspective is, and let them discover what our particular perspective is. And if we believe God has called us together to be the church together, to seek in prayer and faith and trust the common ground which holds us together. And I do think we need to find, this is a kind of a rather more ambitious thought, that we need to find a different way of making decisions that is a much more inclusive approach than the one where you always get a sense that the decision's being made in a different room from the one that you're in. So how do we break that down? I referred earlier to the fact that I seem to be on every committee that you could possibly be on at the moment. In terms of the national church operation, I still don't know where the decisions are made. There is this sort of opacity, which I don't think is about deviousness at all. I think it's just that somehow we've not managed to shake free to enable ourselves to come together trustingly and actually listen to one another, and give ourselves the space to listen to one another. I think one of the really good things, those of us who took part in the shared conversations, remember a few years ago, some of us took part in that, and there was actually space there to listen. And I think some model of that enables us to listen to one another might then discover, as I was trying to say about the Save the Parish or the vision of the church, everybody's concerned about the provision of local ministry. Okay, so let's have a conversation around the provision of local ministry.
Thank you, Bishop. Thank you. That's helpful. Judy Withers, do you want to come and ask your question about laity and give them permission? Judy Withers.
Thank you. I think the Bishop's already answered the question, really, because he picked up on it while he was speaking, right, about enabling people and to be permission giving. So I think, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. That's great. Caroline Jones, you had a question about the viability or what's non-viable and what's viable. Do you want to pick up on that?
Well, I just think I think it adds to the fear of parishes if they feel that they aren't viable, whatever that, and I'd just be interested, to say what defines a viable parish, really. I think there's more and more. It's never been, in my experience, that parishes have been threatened that unless you pay your share, you will be joined up or you won't get a priest. And this is coming in more and more, into the situation where I am. And I find this sad because I think those clergy who are there aren't going to leave, because it's generally on the understanding that it will be somehow, when the present person leaves, that you'll be reorganised. And it's also a bit of a threat to the other parish clergy in their deanery.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the work that Elizabeth and I did 20 years ago, where we said, let's look at vitality rather than viability. And how do you encourage vitality? I think one of the things I would love us to do is to say, what would it mean to put resources in to really revitalizing parishes? And then you can have the conversation where a parish itself might, a congregation may say, actually, we'll be much better off if we merged with, the congregation down the road, which was partly actually one of the exercises that Elizabeth and I were involved in. The congregation, not everybody, but the congregation of the parish we proposed should close and merge with the neighbouring one, which was about, 500 yards down the road. They absolutely were up for that. So it's kind of listening, having those conversations and listening to people and being supportive, and not, as you say, wielding some threat that's tied into the payment of the share. And we've got into an odd situation, and I'm guilty of it here as well, an odd situation with the share where we don't see it as contributing to the good of the whole. We see it as paying for your bit of it. And I don't quite know how we get ourselves out of that, but we have become a bit in a situation of you get what you pay for, rather than you pay in order that the church across the diocese can flourish. So that would be my response at the moment.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Rosemary Waters, I wonder if you've got a good question in there. Can I invite you to talk to Bishop Martin?
Yes, I was just wondering how you would advise urban areas where, to be absolutely honest, there isn't a sense of community because so many people are moving in and out all the time. So that the church is a gathered community, but that isn't helping us to reach people outside the church. And if we go outside the church, which our parish does, and are a presence there, the folk that we are engaging with simply don't have the resources to contribute to the parish share. So this is it's a good mission thing, but it's not going to help us raise money.
Yeah, and that's where I would hope we could get to a point where we could separate out vitality from viability. And what you're talking about is being vital, isn't it? I mean, it's going out into your neighborhood, recognizing that it's a different experience than it was maybe a generation ago, but going out into the neighborhood, making contact, reaching out in one way or another, and people perhaps even being drawn into your fellowship, but they're not going to be the people who are going to kind of cough up the 5,000 a year that you need from each person to contribute to make up the share. But then that shouldn't be the business that we're in. And I think it's a really hard one, but I think this is where I say we've got to look at alternative models of financing the operation, recognizing that if the church abandoned the sort of community that you're talking about, what does that say about our commitment to the poor? What does that say about our commitment to the marginalized, to the people, the children of God that Jesus spent all his time with? If we find ourselves in that situation, then something has gone, I think, just terribly wrong with how we are as a church. Now, I wouldn't report all that to the bishop.
Thank you very much indeed. That's kind. Thank you, Rosemary, for that question. Steve Jordan, you've got a few questions coming in there on finances. Is there anything you would like to ask Bishop Martin. We're mindful of the time, but would you like to come and join us and ask some questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. There's a couple of questions in the chat.
It's really just to say, to me, this is all about material things and resources, and the only answer is consolidation, basically. I totally hear what you say, but what you're kind of not saying is, well, what that really means is churches coming together, particularly in urban environments where there are hugely overbuilt Victorian churches, too close together, never were full. And unless we, as congregations, accept that we aren't English heritage, we are actually out there with a mission and are willing to get together, because unless you have, I think, 50 to 100 people, the administrative load on your church means you're not going to do very much outside. The vicar's going to be busy. You're not going to get people from the congregation. It's about consolidating resources, and we just don't want to do it.
So can I ask you, because my first response to that would be, then how can we go through a discernment process where people together can come to the view that this church perhaps could close, but and we'll go together with that one. Do you see that as a process, or does this have to be some sort of imposed solution?
People have to come to the belief that that is a possibility and are open to it. Top down is very difficult and just leads to more resistance.
Yeah.
It's got to be an acceptance by congregations that they can't do what they should be doing unless they have more resources, and that will only come by getting together with other congregations and growing from that point.
Yes, I can see that, but it's a discernment process that everybody has to be part of.
Yeah.
So here, I give a slightly different answer in the rural communities where, here we've got 479, I think it is 479 or 478 church buildings, and 90% of them are grade 1 or 2 star listed medieval buildings. And they are key buildings in a village, even though they may not attract significant congregations. Although interestingly, rural congregations are often 5% of the population, or you can find 10% of the population of that village on the electoral roll or more. So proportionally, they are significant, but sustaining the buildings is a real challenge. And yet the buildings play that, and we were discovered in the pandemic, a number of places across the county, and I know elsewhere, when the churches were closed, that period they were closed, they suddenly discovered the people who in their village would actually go into the church during the day that they never realized were going in there. And that has underlined for me the importance of keeping them open and the importance of the building in every place. But again, we need a different solution for maintaining the buildings. And it's one of the things we're trying to look at here in Suffolk. And I am very reluctant to close any buildings. There's no building that I'm aware of that's on any list for closure in Suffolk. We've got plenty that have decided or probably will decide to become the so-called festival churches, where they have fewer services. But I was listening to a priest this morning who was telling me that one festival church, one church that had become a festival church, the two ladies that were left in the congregation decided that they would make a good go of harvest, and so they got quite a crew from the village to harvest. Then they decided that maybe they'd start services back up again, and now they've got a regular congregation once a month. So there's a kind of cycle here that we have to recognise, and so keeping them available, open, even if reduced use, I think is crucial. But we need to find another solution for maintaining the buildings.
Yeah, I think that the urban and rural are different problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I take your point completely about the Victorian overbuilding.
See, thank you, Andy. Bishop, I'm mindful of the time. David Lamming, you've got a question. I wonder if we might make this the last question.
He can ask me this. He can ask me his question at Bishop's Council tomorrow.
Okay, right. Well, I'll leave.
Let him ask it. Let him ask it. Let him ask.
You're getting him permission to ask it twice here in this forum and then tomorrow at Bishop's Council. Go on, off you go. Thank you.
I think it's more a matter of whether others will be interested to hear Martin's views about it. We've focused, Martin, on issues about focal or local ministry and the concern to try and establish a local minister in every parish and to sort of build up the church from there, whether that local minister be ordained or lay. But I think one of the problems that we've got in rural areas, as you're very much aware, is the reluctance of people to travel to another church in the same benefice, even if it's only 2 miles down the road. And as I put on the chat, as one former rector in my benefice said many years ago now, when he was asked how he would manage, he said, well, they're all nearer than Tesco. And everybody jumps in their car to go to Tesco, but they're not prepared to go 2 miles down the road or less to worship in another church. So what do we need to do to encourage people to accept a local or focal minister who's not necessarily the rector or vicar who they would expect to be leading worship or leading the church in their particular village?
So I think there are a couple of questions there, David, and let me just answer them briefly. I mean, first of all, you've pointed out that just how important the local is, and how, in terms of, and it's a spiritual importance, isn't it? I mean, I want to challenge it, and yet I also recognise the value, the profound value of this. And in fact, the experience that we've had during Zoom services and other online services, where suddenly people have discovered their neighbours in another village and realised that, as somebody put it, they haven't got two heads, and perhaps we could spend time together. So we're getting shifts in that pattern, more shifts again through the pandemic. I think the question of how a local minister is accepted, it depends in my experience on, if you like, the quality of that, what they provide. If they are there offering pastoral care, if they are there as an active presence, as a Christian witness in that community, then people will come to see that they are the person who they can turn to, that they can accept. And I think, David, I can point you to some deaneries across Suffolk where that process has happened, particularly, and I know this is about ordained, but particularly through our pattern of we've got an internal diocesan ordination pathway. So ordaining local people who are going to serve in their local community. We do the discernment and the training internally, and that has raised up about 50 new priests who are serving their local community, and they are accepted and doing extraordinary things in their village contexts. I can tell you more later, David.
Bishop Martin, thank you very much. That's very helpful. David, thank you. Thank you all for all your questions. They will stay in the chat room and we'll record those. And if there's anything else that Bishop Martin wants to pick up on, we can do so. But I'm mindful of the time and try to be prompt and keep us together. So I want to say thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. But a very special thanks to Bishop Martin for giving up at the evening this evening. We've had a wonderful evening, and the fact that so many questions have come forward, you've initiated lots of thinking. So we're really very, very grateful to you for that. Bishop Martin, would you like to finish us off this evening with close us tonight with a final prayer of blessing?
So let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for the calling that you place on each one of us, and the calling of the communities in which we serve. We ask you to bless those places where we seek to live out our Christian faith in whatever way that is that we believe you are calling us to do. And we ask that we trust you for the provision that we need in order to carry out that which you are calling us to. And we ask you that you bless each one of us and those places where we live and serve, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.